started our conversation for today. And that's allowed us to get some more people here for what we think is a really important conversation and one that we're delighted to have. As ever, we can only have it because of the support that we enjoy from Creative Scotland and also from Education Scotland, who provide the funding and have contributed significantly to the vision behind these conversations. Quick reminder of the house rules, and there are only two. One is, unless you're speaking and have been invited to, please keep your microphone on mute. And the other one is, please use the chat function to put in any questions or comments that you want to make. If you've come along having read the report with questions already in your mind about it, then please add them to the chat. And that means that we can start off with your questions rather than indulging me in asking mine. And I'm sure Ken Muir would rather hear from you than from me. One of the hallmarks of the report that we're discussing today is the extent of the consultation that underpinned it. Ken Muir made a real effort to listen, and I think there's clear evidence in the report that he did that. But I'm also impressed by the range of quotations that are used in the report. And it's not the usual suspects. Ken's been at pains to make sure that there are quotes from class teachers, from students, from other people working in schools. So it really is an effort at engaging the widest possible number of stakeholders, and hopefully we'll continue that today. So please, I will keep an eye on the chat, put your questions in there. We will give people the opportunity to raise their hands and ask questions directly, and we hope again that you'll take advantage of that. I think that's all the background we need, and I'm keen to introduce Ken. I've known Ken for a very long time. I first met him when he was a principal teacher in Ayrshire, and he was organising a meeting of the Association of Geography Teachers in Ayr. And even at that point, I recognised that he was somebody who had the potential to have a real impact on Scottish education. I've had the pleasure and privilege of working with Ken, and he's got some really incredible qualities. From the outset, I recognised that he was totally committed and also incredibly hardworking and able. And I often used to wonder why he worked so hard. Many of us work hard to compensate for a lack of ability. That was never the case with Ken Muir. He had the capacity, but he made sure that no stone was left unturned in realising that capacity. And that's something that I've always admired enormously about him. That all made me relatively unsurprised then at Ken's career in Scottish education. And he's had a glittering career. Most of you who are attending the conversation will know the details of it, but significant figure within Education Scotland, within General Teaching Council of Scotland. And he is somebody who has made a mark and made a very significant mark. So I'm absolutely delighted to welcome him here today. The format is very straightforward. When I shut up, which I promise to do shortly, Ken will take over. He will present probably for around half an hour. And hopefully during that time, we'll begin to back up questions on the chat, and we'll be ready to go with questions and with comments if you wish to make them as soon as Ken finishes his presentation. But as you'll gather, it's with very considerable pleasure that I welcome Ken Muir to Creative Conversations.
Thanks, David. Thanks for these very kind words, and a warm welcome to all of you. I'm delighted that as many of you have managed to take time away from what I'm sure is very busy, hectic schedules that you all have. As I was saying to David when he asked me about doing this creative conversation, I was delighted to do so because I think it is important, in spite of having written just over a 100-page report. It's important that you get the opportunity to understand some of the thinking that lies behind the recommendations. I've tried very hard to bring that out in the report, but you can never do that. And part of the engagement today with yourselves is a real opportunity to allow you to get below the skin of the thinking as to what I've said in the 21 recommendations within the report. As David said, I'm going to speak for about half an hour. What I want to try and do is to share as much of that thinking behind you. I don't doubt that all of you will maybe have glanced at the report. I don't know if many of you have read it all. That's almost immaterial. What I want to do is pick out some of the key messages and key issues that are in the report and give an explanation as to why I'm recommending what I'm recommending in that report. Okay, if you just move on to the first slide then, Jenny, I think that's us. Although I produced this report putting learners at the centre, it actually has spawned 5 documents in total, and I think it's important that you're aware of what they all are. Obviously, in my report itself, there are only 100 hard copies circulating. Most of it is expected to be read online. But there's also the Scottish Government's response to the report, and I want to say something about that. And the next slide, Jenny, there are 3 other documents that are important. One is the consultation report that came through the work that I did with children and young people. David talked about the extensive consultation process that I went through, particularly with learners. And I was very keen to do that, not least because at the end of the day, these are the folk that we are serving within our education system. So I engaged with Children's Parliament, with the Scottish Youth Parliament and the charity together. And those 3 organisations, led by the Children's Parliament, undertook a really extensive consultation on my remit with children and young people. I think we had almost 4,000 young people involved in that. And that report on the left-hand side is the summation of the findings from that exercise. The report in the middle, the consultation analysis, is a document that sets out the entirety of the analysis from all of the national or the public consultation that took place between September and November. And there's a lot that I've taken from that I've embedded into the report, my own report. And then finally, next week, there is a report that's been written for children and young people themselves, which is a kind of summary of my main report. Somebody rather disingenuously referred to it as the Janet and John version, but it's designed specifically to respond and bring a bit of closure to those many learners who were involved in the consultation exercise itself. So I do apologise, having written one report, I've actually created 5 in total. But for me, I felt it was really important that the entirety of those reports became available, and particularly the views of children and young people. And if you maybe go to the next slide, Jenny, there is a really useful summation. It's almost like a kind of cartoon summation of my 21 recommendations. Stephanie Tate, who's previously at Renfrew High School and now with Education Scotland, has done a kind of summation. And you've got on the slides, and I'm assuming you'll all got a copy of those slides, or you can email me and I can send them to you. Stephanie's Twitter handle is up in the top left-hand corner there. She's done this wonderful wee kind of cartoon which summarises the main recommendations. So turning to my report itself, Jenny, the next slide. If you've read it, you'll see there's 6 sections, 21 recommendations. It's important, I think, to stress, by way of background, some of the key messages that I am trying to bring out in this report. My remit was fairly ring-fenced on the surface. There were 3 decisions that were taken by the Cabinet Secretary when I agreed to take on this piece of work. One was that SQA would be replaced. Secondly, that the Inspectorate would be removed from Education Scotland. And thirdly, that Education Scotland be reformed as a result. And There was a further consideration that I was asked to take into account, and that was to set up a curriculum and assessment agency. A lot of folk took that to mean bringing together Scottish Qualifications Authority and Education Scotland. And I have to say, from an early stage, I never ever saw it as that, because one of the things that I'm trying to do in that report is give clarity to the functions that large national bodies like a support agency and a qualifications and examination body have, because part of the issue that I've been trying to address has been that complexity and multiplicity of organisations that are out there in the educational world in Scotland. And my report doesn't solve all of that, but I would like to think that it goes some way towards starting to solve some of these kind of long-term issues and long-term criticisms that we've had in the system. So it's not simply a rebranding of Scottish Qualifications Authority and Education Scotland. If it ends up being that, then that will have been a real disappointment and a missed opportunity, because I do genuinely feel that the feedback I got from folk like yourselves and many others was that this is as good a time as any. Somebody referred to it as a golden opportunity to actually sit down and ask some hard questions about what we want the Scottish education system to look like, what are the purposes of education, and what do we want it to do for current and future learners for the next generation. And as I say there in the next bullet, replacing SQA and reforming Education Scotland can only be the start of a journey. The first two recommendations that I make in the report are about Scottish Government initiating a national conversation, a national discussion on those very things. What is the purpose of Scottish education? What do we want the system to do? Can we arrive at a consensual vision for the future of Scottish education around which everybody can sign up? And I think if we can do that, a bit like what we did over 20 years ago with the national debate in Scottish education, which spawned Curriculum for Excellence, we had everybody very much facing in the same direction with an understanding largely of the direction of travel. And although there were lessons to be learned then from Curriculum for Excellence and some of the things that we should have done better, I do think that this is a really good opportunity 20 years on to have a very similar kind of exercise and to look at a real consensual vision for the future direction. I think we all know from international research and from our own practice that the thing that makes the biggest difference is the quality of learning and teaching in the classroom. And that's why my report is entitled Putting Learners at the Centre. I say in the report that the prime focus of the education system has to be just that. And secondly, supporting teachers and practitioners who support that learning. And that takes primacy over the significance and importance of any parts of the infrastructure, whether it be organisations, support organisations, policy areas within Scottish Government and so on. The focus absolutely has to be on putting the learner at the centre, and that the infrastructure has to be supportive and responsive to what teachers and practitioners require and what learners require. At the moment, one of the criticisms that came through very regularly about the education system, while there's a lot of very good practice out there, was that it's very top-down. It's very hierarchical from the top down. And I talk about a bottom-up hierarchy. And part of what I'm trying to do in that report is create the beginnings of conditions that will create a much more bottom-up hierarchy within the education system in Scotland. And it's one of the reasons why I rejected the notion of a curriculum and assessment agency, because for me, the bit that was missing in a curriculum and assessment agency was actually the bit that makes the biggest difference, and that's learning and teaching, and that close relationship that teachers and practitioners have with children and young people. And we have a system where we have a focus, an overly great focus on examinations and qualifications, important though they are. And what I was trying to do in the report was to create a different kind of environment within the education system, not just in secondary, but across the piece, that focuses on the learner journey from early years right the way through into the senior phase of secondary and beyond into post-school, where the interests and the ambitions and aspirations of individual young people are supported very much as the prime function within the education system, with resource and support and professional learning very much directed towards that one aim of ensuring that learners are very much at the centre as individuals, and that everything is done to support that as much as possible. And that it's not a system that is driven by examinations and qualifications and attainment. As I say, important though they are, at the end of the day, a lot of these policy aspirations around the poverty-related attainment gap and closing that, and bringing greater equity into the education system, that can be achieved by ensuring that high-quality learning and teaching is given primacy, and that all of the resource and all of the support is directed towards supporting those learners and supporting the teachers and practitioners who support that learning. My recommendations also go on to look at building or rebuilding some of the trust and confidence that I think has been lost in the education system in Scotland. And that's not just an SQA issue. I think more generally, if you look at the press and media over recent years, there has been a view that Scottish education was great at one time in the past and is now no longer. I don't subscribe to that personally. I think there is a lot of very good practice, but it's not consistent. And again, I think one of the advantages of moving the inspectorate into an independent body is that it can stand aside and make some quite difficult decisions, and maybe have to tell some quite difficult messages about the education system, but all with the view of getting it right for each individual child. And I talk a lot about in the report about a system that learns from practice, that learns from research, and that learns from the professional expertise of teachers and head teachers in schools. There's massive expertise there. And again, a very strong sense coming through the feedback that I received that it's underused. And part of that bottom-up hierarchy is to try and find the mechanisms by which that kind of expertise can inform much more directly thinking, practice and policy formulation. At the end of the day, the Scottish Government will always have the strategic responsibility for policy, but the means by which that policy is formulated, I think, is open to quite a bit of engagement, and certainly much more engagement than is currently the case with expert practitioners on the ground. And for all of this to work, I talk quite a bit in my report about cultural and mindset shift. And that, I say, has to happen at all levels. At Scottish Government, we need to ensure that all of the directorates and divisions within Scottish Government that are generating policy, and it's not just the Learning Directorate, headed up by Graham Logan, that generates policy that impacts on schools. There's the Advanced Learning and Science Directorate, Post-School Directorate, there's Early Learning and Childcare, there are a myriad, Children and Families, there are a myriad of directorates. We need to make sure that the policy alignment is much better than it is just now, and that the volume of policy that comes out, whether it's from Scottish Government or indeed from local authorities, is at a level that can be managed in a day-to-day basis by head teachers and senior leaders in schools. As part of the exercise, I asked secondary and primary head teachers to go away and think about the number of policies that were impacting on a day-to-day basis on their practice. Secondary head teachers come back with 40, and primary just slightly less, 34. In my view, that was a wholly unacceptable volume of policy, to the extent that one head teacher said to me, "I'm meant to be a leader of learning, and all I have become is a leader of administration." Now, that's just unacceptable. And again, part of the thinking around the report is that that kind of cultural shift within Scottish Government is required in order to try and minimise, and certainly to reduce, but bring to a minimum the amount of policy and the sometimes the misinterpretation and misunderstandings around policy if they are better aligned at the outset. And that mindset and cultural shift goes as far as parents as well. You know, there is a very strong push and a very strong view that the only thing that's worthwhile getting out of a secondary education is a place in university. I mean, I'm generalising in that, but there is that very strong view that that is the purpose of the education system, ultimately, is to get young people into university. We need to change that mindset, and we need to think much more about the individual learner journeys that we want folk to pursue in order to achieve their ambitions, their individual ambitions, which for many will not be going to university. And how do we do that, and how do we value that kind of learning? So those are some of the key kind of thoughts that were behind the 21 recommendations. The next slide, Jenny, just shares with you some of the views of children and young people. And I'll say at the outset, there is a lot that is really good in the education system in Scotland. I've seen it as a chief inspector and an HMI myself. I know it, and I saw it regularly when I was visiting schools when I was chief exec at GTC Scotland. But when young people and children are coming back with comments like this that you see on the screen there, it does call into question just how effective the learning is for those young people, what it is they are getting out of their education system. You know, these are individual youngsters. I'm not saying this is necessarily symptomatic of the system as a whole, but these are individuals who clearly are not getting a good deal out of the education system. And we need to ask ourselves the question, how do we respond to those individuals? You know, this isn't about a class or a cohort going through a secondary school. These are individual young people who are not getting the best deal. And the next slide, Jenny, shows you a graph which comes from the report that was prepared by the Children's Parliament. And it was a response amongst 12 to 18-year-olds to the question, to what extent are you getting, do you think you're getting the best possible educational experience? You know, approximately a third, just over a third, had a negative response to that. They didn't feel that they were getting the best possible educational experience. And what's just as troubling is that in terms of the agrees and strongly agrees, that was only a third as well. So you could draw the conclusion from this slide that in those secondary, amongst those secondary youngsters that were surveyed, you know, only a third of them feel that they're getting something worthwhile out of the educational experience that they're gaining. And, you know, I think that opens up lots of questions about why that is the case and how we can better achieve for those learners as they go through the education system. And as I say, part of my thinking in the report and part of the package of 21 recommendations is as I said, trying to generate a system that is much more predicated on that bottom-up hierarchy, with much more emphasis on the learning and teaching and the support and the assessment as part of learning and teaching as well. I think assessment's been seen as a bit of a dirty word very often, and you know, we had a very successful initiative, Assessment is for Learning, over a number of years in Scotland, and there is already existing good practice around that, but we need to almost reinvent Assessment is for Learning as part of the kind of vision that we have for the education system. There's a diagram at the back of my report in the next slide, which is an attempt to try and show diagrammatically what it is I'm trying to recommend. I was suggesting that aspects of Scottish Government's Curriculum and Qualifications Division and the Insight team, which is the secondary online tool team, moved into this national agency for Scottish education. I was looking at moving the Scottish Qualifications Authority's accreditation and regulation functions into the agency as well, because I felt that that would allow the awarding part of SQA to focus very much on that element and not necessarily the accreditation and regulation as well. I felt it would build a bit of public trust and confidence by having the regulatory function sitting elsewhere and not within SQA itself. And I think it's important to stress that, one of the things that came through very strongly in the feedback that I got was that a lot of folk don't fully understand the full range of functions that SQA undertakes. It's not just about national qualifications. It's very much about a much wider range of qualifications and a much wider range of services around examinations and qualifications that many school folk don't really aren't aware of. And I think it's significant that a lot of that tends to go under the radar, and what SQA is held accountable for very often is the diet of national qualifications and the success or otherwise of that diet. And yet that's 10%. National qualifications are 10% of SQA's qualifications portfolio. So again, I think it is important to stress that point. And the SEQF partnership, I talked earlier about the learner journey and the importance of seeing the learner journey as being something that starts in early years. It's very much seen as the Cinderella of the education system. And yet, I think we all know that, the old adage, the 6 most important years in a child's life up to the age of 5. I think seeing the learner journey develop from early years right through primary and into secondary and beyond has to be part of that vision and has to be supported by the means by which we value the learning at all stages. And part of my thinking in suggesting that the Scottish Credit and Qualifications Framework Partnership moved into the National Agency was to try and provide the glue of that for that learner journey from early years right the way through. Aileen Poynton's team at SEQF do a fabulous job, and they've got huge international reputation out there. And we have this tool in Scotland that, in my view, could be used much more expansively and help to plan and design and recognise learning for individual learners. And then finally, on the right-hand side there, the Education Inspectorate, and I'll say more about that in a minute or two. So in terms of, next slide, Jenny, Scottish Government's response, I've got to say overall, I'm quite pleased with it. They haven't fully accepted all of the recommendations, but they've accepted the recommendations around the need for a renewed vision and largely what I've said about the qualifications and assessment body. They want to look again at the proposal to bring the accreditation and regulation of SQA into the national agency. It's possibly too close to ministers to have a regulatory function there. They weren't keen on transferring, excuse me, and transferring some of the Scottish qualifications, Scottish Government's qualifications and curriculum directorate into the new agency. And the independent registrar for independent schools, who currently sits within Education Scotland, I suggested should move back into Scottish Government, because what I saw that national agency as being was effectively a support agency, and a support agency that was very focused on providing responsive, bespoke support to teachers and practitioners at the sharp end in the classroom and in schools. The inspection functions and what I was recommending were broadly accepted. There's a couple of things about early learning and childcare inspections and the relationship between the Education Inspectorate and the Care Inspectorate that still need to be resolved. And quality assurance in the tertiary sector, there's a big review of the run by the Scottish Funding Council into tertiary education, where my bit of my report sort of sits in between that at one end of the spectrum, and also the National Care Service review at the kind of early learning and childcare sector. And it meant that I had to try and keep an eye on what was happening on both sides of the school sector as part of that. So the government went to go away and have a look at the implications of that. In principle, they've agreed to the heightening of the profile of the Scottish Credit and Qualifications Framework. I'm very pleased about that, even if it doesn't mean the framework, the partnership moves into the national body. And also, I talk in the report about data and the tools for analysing, and I haven't gone into that in an awful lot of detail, but I do think there's work that needs to be done around that as to what data we hold and what data we value and so on. And then they've agreed the final section about the transition in principle and the timescale over which some of this should happen, and there's work going on around that at the moment. The report itself, in the next slide, Jenny, has, I think, had a reasonably positive response. The Scottish Education Journal of EIS talked about it potentially being a step closer to grasping the thistle. There was an article by a former head teacher in the North East, Doug Marr, a couple of weeks ago in the Herald, that basically was saying, you know, that it's a report that offers real change in education. And, you know, I was pleased to see that because that was really what it's been designed to do. But a very cautious note in another Herald article about, you know, as the risk of repeating past mistakes, you know, creating agencies and those agencies not necessarily always delivering what was expected, and the agencies having much more power and influence than the practitioners themselves. So I'm hoping that that will not be the case. Last couple of slides just before we open the discussion. What I tried to do in the report was to set out a number of principles that emerged from the discussions that I had that I think point to what Scottish education in the future should be based around. It certainly has to be based around UNCRC Article 29, because that will become enacted. That you know, children and young people will have legal rights when that becomes enacted in Scotland, and it's got major implications, including in some cases mindset and cultural implications for schools. It certainly has to be there. I talk in the bullet there, the third bullet, about a place-based, responsive, bespoke support. So we have an infrastructure of national bodies, starting with the one that I'm proposing, the National Agency for Scottish Education, that is much more place-based. So I don't necessarily talk about regional improvement collaborators per se, but I talk about regional collaboration. And I know that there are agreements in place between COSLA, Scottish Government, and Education Scotland around the RICs at the moment. I'm proposing a model that exists elsewhere within the Scottish society and within Scottish Government, that Public Health Scotland operate, which is a kind of joint sponsorship approach, which gives more control and more certainty over the funding that's available at a local and a regional level. So Scottish Government are looking into that. A lot of feedback on the importance of early years and outdoor learning, and you know, I'm not going into that in any great detail, but it was interesting that the consultation that I undertook attracted some responses from colleagues that I used to work with in Finland, suggesting that Scotland should become the 6th Nordic country and have a much greater focus on early years, kindergarten education and outdoor learning. They saw that as a way forward, but equally so did many Scottish teachers, particularly primary teachers, the importance of early years and some of the methodologies in early years coming into early primary as well. Just picking up on a few other things, you know, I think if we can get clarity around policy and the greater alignment and coherence of policy, a lot of the bureaucracy that you in particular suffer from will be minimised, because I think there'll be much greater clarity around what expectations are of people out there. Young people, you'll know yourselves, they see climate change and learning for sustainability as being right up there, top of the agenda. And a lot of them asking me the question, you know, where does this appear in the curriculum? When is the curriculum going to deal with some of these really meaty matters that we're going to have to live with in future? Yeah, that, just touching on a couple of others, the redistribution of power and influence and resource, a bottom-up hierarchy. Part of what I see the National Agency for Scottish Education doing is much more than what Education Scotland itself is doing, but actually bringing together some of the think tanks and some of the thinking, creating the opportunities for groups to get together and to influence what's needing to change, what's happening that's good practice, but what needs to change. How does that then inform any curriculum change, and how then does the learning and the teaching and the curriculum and what we value around all of that then influence or direct Qualifications Scotland, my terminology for the replaced SQA, what it is we then examine and how we then go about examining that. And a lot of it is about building, as I said, trust and improving relationships across all parts of the system itself. A couple of final points. I talked a bit about cultural and mindset shift. Jenny, the next slide. For me, culture and mindset are about relationships, attitudes, values, and behaviour. And those for me are three really critical parts of the sections of the report. First of all, that absolute primacy of focus on individual learners and their diverse needs. The support then that teachers and practitioners require from the system. Much more responsive, much more bespoke, much more direct than is the case in the past. And then this reorientation of resource, the allocation of resources supporting local decision making, and the redistribution of power and influence. As I say, these for me are really three key drivers in creating the kind of culture and mindset that we need for the education system of the future in Scotland. And the last couple of slides, Jenny. Next steps. Scottish Government have already put together a couple of groups that are looking to move forward with my 21 recommendations. They are looking to produce some information, I've said, in the spring around the structures relating to the new organisations. They are actively seeking a fairly well-known individual who I gather has been signed up to lead the vision exercise, as they're calling it, the national conversation or the national discussion on a consensual vision for Scottish education. So you need to keep your eyes open for that. As I said earlier, they want to look at where they will place SQA's current accreditation and regulation functions. It won't be with the examination body, as I understand, but at the same time, they don't want to create a new national body because there is a bit of a cull on national bodies, as I understand it. How the SCQF impact can be enhanced, something promised by the summer around that. Consultation on early learning and childcare inspection options, again, something before the summer on that. And although they're talking about fully operational bodies after Diet 2024, I think there are some things, well, I know that there are some things that they're looking to introduce much more quickly. And finally, just a reminder that Louise Hayward, the professor at Glasgow, is taking forward this national qualification, or it's a review of assessment and qualifications. It's fundamentally looking for at national qualifications, but a lot of the evidence that I picked up and the feedback I got from individual teachers like yourselves, head teachers, but particularly young people, I have fed into Louise's early deliberations around what that might look like. Okay, I think that's the last slide, other than, yes, and you've got my details there if anybody wants to get in touch with me at all. And as I say, if I don't know, David, if the slides are being made available to all participants, but if they're not, anybody can get in touch with me and I can send on a set of them. So that's really where I want to stop. Again, it's a delight to be here and to take part in this and to have the opportunity, hopefully, to explain a wee bit of the background that might help to link together some of the recommendations that are in my report. And I'm grateful to you for listening and look forward to some of your questions. David.
Ken, you've certainly done that. You've certainly opened up the report. You've certainly given people a real sense of background on it, I'm sure. You've also done us an enormous favour, because there are so many aspects of earlier conversations that you've tapped into. We had Louise Hayward on as part of a creative conversation around assessment with Mark Priestley and others, so great to get the mention there. Some really fascinating and interesting overlaps with the conversation that we had with Tim Brighouse and Mick Waters talking about their book about our schools and improving in previous best, and there's a lot of echoes there. And obviously, interestingly touching on some of the conversation we had with Graham Donaldson when we discussed development in Wales. So again, you've reinforced the connections, and you have also, by far most importantly, stimulated questions already. Emma G was the first in. Emma, do you want to come in live and ask your question?
I'm just very taken, I suppose, Ken, with this idea of the bottom up hierarchy and what that might actually mean. And then I could see a linkage later when you talked about kind of the Nordic systems actually coming up through from the early learning. Here in Orkney, I've been working on a creative learning network project that's about creative leadership, that's got that kind of focus around pupil-led curriculum design. And what we're hearing in the schools that have been working with us over the last 3 years is just constantly that frustration in the primaries, where the early years stuff that is so open and open weave gets worked out of the system too quickly. But it's that kind of approach that has, I suppose, the catch for primary particularly, but I suspect secondary could benefit. So I was just wondering if that's what you kind of mix. I thought that meant, if you're coming from the bottom up, you're coming from the kids first and the youngest first.
Very much so, Emma, and I think that one of the documents that we produced for Curriculum for Excellence that seemed to disappear very quickly, and I always found it the most interesting and potentially the most useful, was Building the Curriculum 2, the active learning document. And there's a lot of really good practice. I talked earlier about early years and childcare being the kind of Cinderella sector. There's a lot of wonderful work takes place in there, and there's a lot of very good learning takes place in there. And we see that in a lot of the Scandinavian systems as well. As I say, the Finnish system's the one that I've been closest to. And of course, they don't start formal education and school education until the age of 7 over there. And there's a debate, I think, to be had around all of that as part of this discussion. But I think we need to better recognise, as part of the mindset and cultural shift, the value of early years. And as I said in my presentation, the learner journey actually starts there. It doesn't start when kids choose their subjects at the end of S2 or at the end of S3 in a secondary school, which again I think is a view that's generally held out there, if not by teachers, then certainly I think by others in the system. So I think changing the telescope, if you like, of rather than have young people looking at what's coming down at them from whether it be Scottish Government or local authorities or individual schools, it's more about turning the telescope the other way and looking at the young person and getting them to indicate what it is they feel that they require, as much as what the system itself expects of young people. So, but you're right, and it sounds simple, but it's actually quite radical, because we haven't had that in Scotland. We really haven't. And if you do go to any of the Scandinavian countries, which you may very well have done, there is a much more bottom-up, it sounds quite a derogatory term, but a much more bottom-up feel to the education system. There's a feeling that the individual institutions and the individual teachers are more generally empowered, or they have more agency, they have more autonomy, they have more support for that than I think we often have in Scotland. And some of that's a fear factor in Scotland. But if I can maybe just, if you can indulge me for a minute, David, something I used to do as an HMI. I think I maybe mentioned this to you, David, before. I was always interested when I was inspecting a primary school that had a nursery and listening to the conversations that usually the mother or the granny had with the young person when they dropped them at the door of the nursery compared to the door of primary 1 or primary 2. And the kind of conversation in the nursery that they tended to have was, you know, the mother or the granny would be saying, you know, make sure you enjoy yourself and make sure you play with your friends and, you know, have a good time. And the conversation was very much around that. And I've actually heard the self-same individual, mother or granny, then drag their P1 or P2 people to the front door. And of course, they didn't get into the primary school, get into the early learning centre bit or the nursery bit. And that the conversation was, make sure you listen to what the teacher says, make sure you sit down, make sure you behave. It was a completely different conversation that they had. And that always struck me as really, I'm not saying that's a generalization, but it struck me that the mindset was very different to what the expectations were of what happens in a preschool setting and what happens in a school setting.
Thanks for that, Ken, and thanks for that, Emma. I mean, just a couple of points very quickly. One, I think I never miss a chance to make this comment. When we produced the summary documents of the Building the Curriculum documents, and we produced the summary version of Building the Curriculum 2, we extended the principle of early learning beyond, of active learning beyond early years. And that's something that unfortunately I don't think was picked up. The other thing I think is we're building up a really interesting conversation here. We've got comments in the chat from Miss Newbold and also from Lorna French, whom I'm going to bring in later. But Miss Newbold, he said very formally, do you want to come in with your questions? Because you've already stimulated a bit of debate in the chat.
It wasn't necessarily to sort of like stimulate a debate, although it kind of went that way. It was more just to sort of work out what the pupils consider to be their best possible experience, because obviously there were secondary pupils that were asked about it, but one of the things that comes up regularly in my primary 6 classroom is, why are we doing this? This is so boring. And the conversation goes in a direction of like, what's the point if it's not fun? But does it necessarily have to be fun to be deemed a successful education? Obviously, it has to be engaging, and they have to be involved with their learning. But I'm feeling that like over the years, it's got harder and harder to engage learners unless it's an all singing, all dancing lesson. You know, and I'm just wondering, like, does it have to be considered fun to be successful? If that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, and the answer simply is no, it doesn't. I mean, there are, you know, the education and learning is to generate all sorts of qualities and dispositions and attitudes and so on, and some of that is about engaging in what can sometimes seem quite boring stuff, to be honest. But I think the point you're making, though, kind of reinforces the point that one of the key messages in my report is that we need to give teachers the time and the opportunity to focus on what is working well and to engage and collaborate with each other, because sometimes you and your class might find that something is pretty boring and they're not finding it fun, but you may very well find that a stage partner does it a different way, which makes it a bit more interesting and a bit more fun and a bit more exciting. And we don't really have much in the way of opportunity because of the amount of contact time we have in Scottish schools. We don't really have the opportunity to have that kind of conversation. I'm reminded of a discussion that took place in an upper secondary school in Finland that I visited once, just on the outskirts of Helsinki. And I was in the staff room listening to the staff talking, and I wasn't able to translate everything perfectly, but I knew enough to realise that what they were talking about were how to teach a lesson that both teachers had recently been trying to teach, and what they come up with was a kind of compromise in making it a much more interesting and much more enjoyable experience all round. And I think that's how we develop as professionals, but through that kind of collaboration. But it doesn't necessarily it doesn't need to be fun to be successful. It doesn't need to be. It's not successful only when it's fun. I think we need to be sensible about what it is we can do in preparation for some lessons that naturally might not be all that great fun to prepare for, either by yourselves or for the youngsters.
Happy with that?
Yes. It was more just because obviously there's times when I would have considered the lesson to be successful if they've learned how to do something. I don't know, prepositions was today's example, and they hated it, but they all understood by the end of the lesson what a preposition was. So they might have not told you that it was successful, but they could tell me what a preposition was. So even though it was boring, from my perspective, being different to theirs, it was, that was just my point. Thank you.
Okay, good.
I mean, I think there's something interesting, because we've, again, in previous conversations, we've touched on the idea of young people. The research telling us that young people are most engaged when they're most challenged. And the idea that we entertain and dumb down doesn't necessarily translate into engagement. That often it's when curiosity is aroused. There's points we're going to come on to in the chat around the role of creativity, around us not providing the entertainment in the lesson, but the young people generating the dynamic of the lesson, which is something, Ken, that you'll have come out with very strongly in your discussions with the Children's Parliament.
Very much so. And, going back to Emma's point earlier, I mean, I know we're talking about early years, but I mean, I was horrified. I had a conversation with a primary 1 teacher, and I'll not mention the local authority or the school, but 5 weeks into her primary 1 class, the deputy head had asked her to fill in a spreadsheet that colour-coded all 23 children in her class on a green, amber, red, in terms of the progress that the children were making. And as the primary 1 teacher said to me, she said, this is clearly a deputy who hasn't a Scooby about early primary education to ask something as crass as that. She said, they're hardly getting used to coming to school, and here am I being asked to effectively categorise those children 5 weeks into their formal education experience in primary school. And she refused to do it. And I mean, she got a rap in the knuckles for it and ended up having to do it because apparently her head teacher likes looking at spreadsheets and so on. But that's the kind of bureaucratic activity that, in my view, we need to strip out the system, because it does nobody any good. And it's a school as well that undertakes classroom observations or peer observations, and never get any feedback on it. So why are these things taking up time when the focus could be much more in preparing for good learning and teaching?
Yeah, and I think that's really helpful to make these kind of points. I'm also delighted that we've got Lorna French with us today. Lorna's the acting head of schools and lifelong learning for Edinburgh. I know that you were busy with an improvement meeting earlier on today, Lorna. So delightful that you're showing the stamina to come along. And I think you want to open up the discussion about that whole idea of the learning journey from early years through to tertiary. So Lorna, welcome to the conversation.
Thank you. What a lovely welcome. I'm astonished that you can speak Finnish, that Sharon McGee, I think in the chat, can speak Finnish, that you chose building the curriculum too, because I think if I was framing an interview question, I would be writing down building the curriculum 4. But anyway, all of these things aside, Ken, I think just on behalf of my colleagues in Edinburgh, we very much welcome the report and thank you for setting it out so clearly and presenting it so clearly today. Personally, I'm so pleased to see your emphasis on various different things. So I think the obvious one for anybody that's ever worked in a primary school is a recognition of the interface that's needed with the senior phase. So that's a given. But from what you said earlier about it's all about the quality of learning and teaching in the classroom, and it's just the hardest part though, is that it's really hard to get that right system wide. So one of the things that we're doing in Edinburgh is our teachers charter. So we've identified 4 key components, and one of them is assessment for learning.
Yeah.
So we're putting a huge amount of effort into equipping our teachers with those skills. But I didn't want to just chunter on about all of that. What I really wanted, and it came after a meeting yesterday with Edinburgh College, and we were talking about, I said, how is the Muir report touching your world and your work? Because we quite often find ourselves in meetings with our college partners looking at alternative curriculum and the school-college partnership, and how do we give those young people that don't necessarily are not on a path to a degree, how do we give them the pathway that they need collectively? And I'm also going to throw into this 21 hours. And what are we going to do about that particular conundrum? And is there a space within this whole evolving landscape to talk more formally with our tertiary partners and to see them as a really integral part of the senior phase? So it's just to see if you had any thoughts on that.
Oh, lots of thoughts on it, Lorna. Yeah, and you know, I'm pleased that you've picked up on the importance of that learner journey from early years right the way through. As I said in the presentation, it's one of the part of the thinking behind trying to bring SCQF closer to and enhancing the learner journey. In terms of the opportunities for individuals pursuing a journey that is appropriate for them and that they would like to, I go back to a strange situation that I came across when I was inspecting, where I found myself inspecting 2 secondary schools about 5 miles apart in the same local authority. And one of them created, because I did the school timetable for about 3 years in the school that I was in Dreghorn, and my starting point was not to have a fixed template of a timetable, but was to start with the young people themselves and ask them what it was that they wanted to study, and then create a template round about that. And you know, sort of didn't get 100%, but certainly 95% of the young people got what they wanted out of it. I notice that Pauline's on the group, is on the chat tonight, Pauline Walker at Royal High, and you know, she's done a lot of work with the Bosch group around curriculum planning and so on. But this was a school that offered a myriad of opportunities for young people, and yet, and it wasn't Edinburgh City, I'll say, but this other school that I inspected about 2 or 3 weeks later had a very, very restricted timetable. And you know, part of the complaints that we got from parents in the questionnaire returns, and part of the complaints we got from the young people themselves in their questionnaire returns, was that you know, they were being forced to do, they've been forced to do subject X, and they didn't want to do it, but it was the only thing that was in the column because I hated everything else, kind of thing. So it's always had me thinking, what are the factors that create those situations whereby you can have such inequity of opportunity through the curriculum. Now, you'll get some head teachers will say it's because of resource, and you know, I'm not arguing with them, but but more often than not, I think it's about that culture and mindset. It's about, you know, what do we focus on? What is the purpose of us being here? a lot of deputies that I have known and have worked with and inspected, you know, are very proud of the template, the timetabling template that I've had. I even had one deputy head who told me that, you know, basically they had the same timetable template for the 12 years that he had been a deputy. And I was just appalled at that, because it didn't move with the times at all. And I think part of my big message within the report of putting learners at the centre is that we do genuinely need to think much more about what are the wishes, the aspirations, the desires and so on of the individual young people, and to try and manage the system that offers the opportunity to deliver that as much as possible. And it also touches on one of the other long-term issues that you'll appreciate we'll have in Scottish education, is that parity of esteem between the vocational, technical and academic. And one of the reasons why I was keen that SCQF had much greater influence is there's huge expertise in that small team that Aileen Ponton's got in recognising prior learning. And that's not an expression that you hear mentioned much in Scottish education. But I think if we are going to nail this parity of esteem issue, then for me, you know, using SCQF as a glue to the learner journey, and having the infrastructure in place that is much more individual learner focused, bringing the two of those together, I think gives us a better chance of ensuring that young people enjoy their learning experience, but also get the opportunity to maximise their achievements in the widest sense, and to move through the learner journey as seamlessly as possible.
Lorna, do you want to come back on that at all?
Just to say that I fundamentally agree with you. You know, I think that we, and Linda's popped in the chat, it's one of the pillars of our strategy is actually to start with the child, the young person, and help them find their passion, find their inspiration, whatever you want to call it. It is hard manoeuvring different stakeholders, and in particular in a city that's quite political. And people have quite entrenched views about what a quality education is. So it does make it more difficult, but it's not impossible. And you're right to quote Pauline, because she was able to bring her parent body with her. But it does take a lot of work. So it's great to have that recorded nationally. Can I make one wee other comment?
Sure.
If you don't mind, it's also what you said there about the culture change and the values and behaviours. And Ken, sometimes I think if you get the right people and you give them the right support, you don't need to make massive organisational change, because those people, like you've quoted yourself, you can do it without all of the engines grinding round about you, just with having the right attitude.
I couldn't agree more, Lorna. And you know, it's a question that I've often been asked is, was the decision by Scottish Government to replace SQA and Reform Education Scotland the right starting point? Now, it was the right starting point in the sense that that was the remit I was given. But at the same time, I think recommendations 1 and 2 in my report around the national conversation and the national discussion, and I use an expression within that second recommendation about narrative privilege being accorded to all, because I think that goes with the grain of what I'm trying to say in one of my key messages, that we need to make sure that everybody from the grassroots upwards gets the opportunity to engage in this national discussion, who wants to engage in it. Because I think even although the national debate 20 years ago, you know, was a major change in the way in which we operated, we need to make sure that the voices from the grassroots, and by that I mean the learners as well as the teachers and practitioners and head teachers and so on, that they actually are heard and acted on. We can't have any kind of filtering of that. in whatever comes out in terms of any consensual vision. We just need, it's just a risk I think that we just need to be aware of, that you know, that folk who are at the sharp end of things, that their experiences are at least as valuable, if not more valuable, than some others who might be engaged in that discussion. So that narrative privilege, I think, is really important.
And I think that's something that's really dogged us in terms of Scottish education, Ken. One of the things that we were discussing was that every major initiative in Scottish education prior to Curriculum for Excellence foundered over workload. And so there was a real move that I spoke about in terms of Curriculum for Excellence to go back into the profession to make sure they were willing to deliver. And in a sense, that gave narrative privilege back to the profession. And I think your point about getting that balance right, not taking the narrative right away, but taking that absolute privilege away and opening up that wider discussion, I think is a powerful one. We've got Stephen Gilhooly, who made a point in the chat. Stephen, I think it's a point well worth making. Do you want to come in and make it yourself?
Yes, thanks, David. Hi, Ken. It's nice to speak to you. Yeah, you pointed out we've covered most of it before.
But albeit briefly.
Yeah, but I'm looking at the cultural and mindset change, and that's especially in the secondary sector in particular, but I think it happens in the primary as well. So my question was, how can we encourage our schools to creatively redesign their curriculum with a focus on Article 29? To reflect the rapid changing learning landscape. Now, Ken, I lead on sustainability and children and young persons' participation in the city. And we talked about stakeholders as well. I think we just need to influence our leaders and try and promote that. So it's supporting leadership, giving them confidence, getting that mind shift there as well. Because certainly if you consider all the stakeholders involved in that, I don't think the young people are included in that at all. I think they're up for the mind shift change, the cultural changes. It's getting the rest of the stakeholders on board and trying to get other elements to the 3 to 18 that Lorna talked about, such as more effective, better transition, cross-sector working, and more creative pathways and options for young people as well.
Yeah, and I think that was one of the surprises for me, Stephen, and I reference it in the report, is that in spite of what we've all gone through, and you and other colleagues in particular, over the last 2 years, I was surprised at the willingness for folk to engage in further reform, because I think there is a genuine acceptance out there that this is a point in time that we can't lose. And we need to act on it. And in terms of encouraging the schools to design creatively around Article 29. I mean, it's not just Article 29. You'll have heard, I'm sure, Graham Donaldson, when he spoke to you all, would talk about the distractors that are out there in the system. They're very real. And it's about climate change, and it's about technology, and it's about artificial intelligence, and it's society has changed massively, and young people have changed massively in the last 10 years. It's interesting talking as part of my engagements with teachers, and a lot of them, I asked the question, to what extent do you think young people have changed in the last 10 years? The last 5 to 10 years, massively. So, the education system cannot stand still, and it needs to take account of those distractors, or those factors that are impacting not just on education but on society more generally, and make sure that we create the kind of society that will allow young people to thrive as best as possible in what can only be increasingly changeable times. And how we do that is, I think, partly through getting agreement and alignment around what we want the education system look like and what we want it to do, and to bring together, you know, not just the academics and the researchers of this world and looking at what's happening in other countries, but genuinely engaging in that you know, that narrative privilege with as wide a range of folk as possible, informing that direction of travel. And you know, UNCRC Article 29 in particular, it's going to have massive impact on how teachers engage with young people and how they see young people, because you know, for the first time ever, when that becomes enacted, children will have rights, and you know, there's a legal basis for that, and you know, some teachers I've spoken to are actually quite fearful of what it could mean. I don't think it will ever get to the extremes that some of them are imagining, but it creates a very different kind of environment to the one that we've had in the past and that we've currently got just now.
I think he's been making a number of interesting points that'll take the discussion forward. So, Catherine, do you want to come in?
Hi, Catherine.
Hello, hopefully you can hear me.
Yeah.
Thanks, it's all been really interesting. No, it was just a couple of things I was thinking when you were talking about, I suppose that balance between the fact that teachers struggle with coverage of experiences and outcomes, and that takes over. It takes over from some of the really important cross-cutting themes. So that was just one of the things that was in my mind, and that sort of balance. But how do you strike that balance between children leading learning and being involved in curriculum design, but also making sure that we're delivering what we need to deliver? So that's no easy thing to do. So I suppose it is all about what is that balance. The other point I was just making, although I haven't spoken to primary 1 teachers, I'm a deputy, so I haven't spoken to primary 1 teachers at week 5 of P1 and asked them how their children are getting on. However, in saying that, the primary 1 teachers need to make judgments by the end of primary 1, and that goes very quickly. So actually, unfortunately, these conversations need to happen not at week 5, but quite early. And you know, that is not helping us. That's not helping the focus being around learning, quality learning, and also our idea of what assessment actually is and should mean, which is something that actually improves learning and teaching. So those were just my thoughts, not really a question, but a tiny bit of defence for that deputy, I suppose.
Yeah,
because sometimes that's coming from above, you know.
Yeah, I suppose the point I'm making though, Catherine, is, you know, does it need to be colour coding these children? Because that goes on the record, and you know that you know, in further discussion with that primary 1 teacher, she was talking about, you know, families that had gone through the school, and you know, this is a younger sibling of X who created Mary Helen when he was in, or she was in P5 or P, you know. So I think there is something around that. The other point you're making about cross-cutting, I think, is really interesting, because as I was saying to David and earlier on, before we started, I mean, one of the things that a lot of folk aren't aware of is that when the Finnish education system were looking to introduce their new curriculum in 2016, they went to about 15 or 16 different countries around the world, and the one that they got the most out of was CFE in Scotland. And what they did was they introduced a mandatory cross-disciplinary or interdisciplinary module. Now it's subject to quite a bit of academic research in Finland at the moment to see how useful and valuable it's been, because it's been implemented in very different ways. But you know, I do think that there is something that certainly primary schools generally, I think, do better than in secondary, but that's largely because secondary's very much subject driven by examination requirements. But the whole notion of interdisciplinary learning, yes, you need a knowledge and understanding base on which to found that, but opportunities for children leading, you know, what I would call organic or discovery-based learning, when it's done well, it's hugely effective, as you'll know yourself. And sometimes it just takes a bit of confidence for teachers to say, I'm going to depart from from that, and I'm going to do it. You know, it's a nice sunny day. I'm going to take them outside. I don't necessarily have anything in mind that I'm going to do, but I'm going to make sure that there's good learning takes place within that. And very often the children themselves generate that learning, as you know.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Okay, I'd like to invite Mike Irving to come in. He's made a very lengthy comment in the chat, and I think it's one that's worth airing. So, Mike, would you like to come in?
Thanks, David. Hi, Ken. How you doing?
Right, Mike. Nice to see you.
Listen. It's stuff that Ken you've really alluded to across the session, which has been really helpful. And you spoke a lot about the Scandinavian system and a lot about the report and the recommendations. And certainly for us at Leith Academy and my colleagues, as secondary colleagues across our authority, there is a real hope that we're looking at some macro and some really quite big level changes. So the point in my chat was around two quite big aspects that create a judgmental and risk-averse system of one, inspection. Not to say that we don't think that scrutiny or challenge is important, but the way in which inspection works just now, potentially judgmental narratives, some outward-facing public documentation, which can be quite challenging for school communities, and then coupling that with the government influence around absolutely having it squarely on manifestos to improve outcomes for all young people. But then, and this is a difficult one to answer, you know, is there any way of having a society where we are not able to report on schools in a ranking order from top to bottom based on how many get 3 at level 6? Because for all the work we may try and do in the background to all of that and trying to make the system more creative and more engaging, heads have in the back of their heads, as we all know, the avoidance of the judgment. And I think if we can get to a place where our culture and our society, similar to that of some Scandinavian examples, are away from that, then I think that would be a really, really positive step for us. I know that you allude to that in the report.
Yeah, no, I think these are good points, Mike. And Graham Donaldson and I appeared in front of the Education and Skills Committee about a month ago, and we were asked that very question about what an independent inspectorate would look like that's different and how it would operate. And one of the things we said was one of the first things that should be done is to drop the scores in the doors, because very often that is what most folk focus on, you know, the gradings. So I think there is a way to, there are steps that can be taken fairly quickly with a new independent inspectorate that I think will help to build confidence and build a bit more trust. I think greater use of validated self-evaluation. I know we've gone down that road for a while. I remember when I was Director of Inspection, we introduced the sharing of an agenda. So I think there were 2 or 3 QIs that HMI picked, and there was a couple of QIs that the school itself picked to focus on as part of the inspection. So it was much more a kind of partnership kind of inspection. But I think the real trick in all of this, Mike, is it goes back to one of the big issues that we've got is the over focus on examinations driving the system. And again, it goes back to the thinking I had around SCQF. I know I keep coming back to it, but I think if we can find a way in which SCQF actually accredits learning across the piece, then that learning can be recognised through the framework, and there then is no need to look simply at the number of hires at 5+ or 3+ at level 6, because there'll be lots of other ways of demonstrating achievement in its widest sense, which actually incorporates attainment as a subset. And, you know, again, it comes back to that cultural and mindset shift. If we can get the bits of that jigsaw in place, then I think we're part way down the road to addressing some of the kind of issues that you were talking about there yourself. The judgmental aspect of inspection, I think there'll always be an element of that, but I think it's going to be a challenge for whoever it is that's going to lead that new independent inspectorate to be able to revise the approaches to inspection with the system, as opposed to saying, you know, this is what we're going to sit down and do. Because interestingly, I'm preparing for a meeting on Thursday with the Scottish Council for Independent Schools. And, you know, I was reading through the consultation returns that had come in from the independent schools, the principals and head teachers and so on. And one of them basically said, why can't we have inspection on demand? You know, so if we get to a point where we think we are in a good place to be inspected, or we've undertaken some work that we would like an independent evaluation of, why can't we have that? Now, you run the risk of nobody being inspected with that model if you apply it to the letter of the law. But actually, there is something in it. There's a kernel of something in that. So I think there's a real challenge for whoever it is that's going to lead that inspectorate to engage with the system and to look at how inspection can provide support to schools, but at the same time, as I mentioned earlier, you know, tell truth to power, because that's what an independent inspectorate should be able to do. It should be able to go to ministers and say, Minister, we need a policy in this. This isn't working well enough, and all of our evidence demonstrates that, but in a supportive way.
There's so many points that have been touched on, and Emma Easton making some really good points about how do we make sure that those who cannot speak still have a voice, or those who find it difficult and challenging to speak still have a voice. And there's lots of interesting points being made about curricular approaches, about the importance of creativity, as you would expect in this conversation. But I think what we've got very clearly is a ringing endorsement of the breadth of approach. I think what the challenge will be for us is not to fall into the situation we fell into with Curriculum for Excellence, where throughout the discussion, people were absolutely in favour of the ideology, the philosophy, the aims, the ambitions of Curriculum for Excellence, until the detail emerged. And I think that's going to be one of the challenges for us. And you've alluded to that yourself, the importance of meeting the challenges you've set for an independent inspectorate. And I think there'll be real interest in the announcement of who's going to lead that national discussion. I think there'll be a real fascination around that choice that's made around that. I think there'll be some really interesting discussions to be had around some of the key appointments and the key details in terms of taking that forward. I think what you've done today has demonstrated why there was a huge amount of trust and goodwill for your own appointment and your own involvement in this particular exercise. I think you've been really open. I think you've listened. I think you've been absolutely painstaking in terms of responding to the detail of the questions, and incredibly comprehensive as well. And we're very grateful to you for that. Very grateful to the 24 folk who managed to stick with us right through till nearly 6 o'clock. Thanks to you, thanks to everybody who participated earlier. Thanks for the excellent quality of the questions, and thanks for there being so many things left unsaid. Okay, thank you very much, everyone, and good night.